Hi, my name is Sage, and this week, I want to make a crow that sits in a pumpkin. And in order to begin my journey, I'm gonna need some tinfoil and some clay. Next, I'm gonna have to scrunch up some tinfoil as I am making the pumpkin base. But since I didn't grab enough tinfoil on my first go, I then take a little bit more and wrap it around, and wha-bam, it kind of looks like the beginning of a pumpkin, and then wha-bam times 2. I cover it in clay, and now it really looks like a marshmallow, but that's okay. With the power of the ball stylus, and I really go ham with it, as you can tell, I carve out the top before then folding down and blending out the edges that form. So now it kind of looks like a flower pot, but since we're not going for a flower pot and we're going for a pumpkin, I then add in the pumpkin ridges. And I do that by taking my pointy stylus and just running it down until I run out of space. And now that he's looking like a pumpkin, I then move on to getting some more tinfoil and scrunching that up, and this will be the beginning of the crow's head. Next, I pop the tinfoil up top of the pumpkin to see if I like it, and I do. So with the power of transition, he's covered in clay now. But then I noticed I added a bit too much clay, so I take some off before re-smoothing him all out, and now he kind of looks like a head. And the next step of making him look like a crow is to give him a beak, and to do so, I pull out some clay from his face before then adding a little bit more before blending it all out with my ball stylus. And speaking of ball stylus, I then used the small one to poke in some eye sockets. And this was the first and only time that I poked them in. I was so proud of myself. So now that they look like this, I then get some tinier pieces of clay and roll them up into tiny spheres and poke them into the eye sockets to make them eyes. And again, this was the first time. I was so excited. Usually it takes me like so many. But then I noticed that his head is looking a little flat, so I add some more clay onto it and blend that out. Next, I give him a little smile on his beak, because obviously he's a happy little crow. I then pop him back in his pumpkin, and now I can start to work on the top of the pumpkin. You may be like, Sage, what? He's gonna wear the top of the pumpkin on his head. And so I flatten a piece of clay before then adding some tinfoil up top of it, and then adding even more clay, because you know how pumpkins, how there's the skin of the pumpkin, and then like underneath it's like the meat of it. I wanted there to be like a separation between the two, because that just made sense in my brain, and then I ended up with this. That was my bad. First try isn't always correct, but then I rework it, and I do so by squishing it and basically starting completely over and using my ball stylus. Next, I use my pointy stylus to make an indent in between the skin of the top and the meat of the bottom. Then I put it up top of his head, and I like the way it looks, so then I use my pointy stylus to carve in the pumpkin ridges while also making sure that they align with the ones on the bottom. And what pumpkin is complete without a stem? So I add a stem, and now the pumpkin is complete. Or so I thought. The hat ended up just being a little bit too thick for my liking, so I sliced part of it off. And I continue slicing and dicing, and then I move on to fixing it all over again. So I just do some touch-ups and smooth some parts out and carve the indents back in. And now the hat looks complete to me. But what's not complete is the crow. So I take some tinfoil and I scrunch that up as I am now making his tail. And this is what it looks like with the tinfoil. And this is what it looks like covered in clay. And you may be like, Sage, that looks a little big. And you're right. So I take the rolling pin and roll it all out. Next, I rip off a piece before then flattening out the sides and realizing, you know what? It's still way too big. So I take the scissors and I start cutting. And I treat it like I would bangs, you know? I start small with small cuts just to make sure, because I can't add more back onto it, even though I can because it's clay, but there's tinfoil in the middle. So, you know, it's kind of like a sandwich, and that's a lot, and I don't want to repackage it. So I just take my time before then flattening everything out, and then taking my pointy stylus and running it down the tail to make some very basic feathers. Next, I put it on the back of him, and it looks decent, so I'm happy, yay. So then I take some more clay, and I end up blending that clay in between the tail and the pumpkin to meld everything together. And I continue doing this process for a while, before then taking another piece of clay, flattening that out by any means necessary, and then taking my pointy stylus and carving in some lines into that piece of clay, as this will be a wing. And I'm just gonna do a super simple wing for this crow because I just think he's a nice little simple guy. I then attach him and blend him out a little bit around the edges. And this is what one wing looks like. And bam, this is what two wings look like. So now that he can fly, I then get some wire and I cut it and it hits him in the head. Oh no. But I can't just cut one, I cut two, as these will be his little leggies. Next, I take some smaller wire and wrap it around the thicker one, and I do that on both of them, as this will help the clay adhere to it. And speaking of clay, bam! They are both covered now, so I take my small ball stylus and poke in the holes where I want them to go, and then I rip off some of the clay that I put on, so then I can smush in the legs into the pumpkin so it looks like he's sitting. Next, I take my ball stylus and start blending the legs to the pumpkin, and I also make the legs a little bit more texture just because everything else is so smooth, and I just thought that was the move. But then I go too ham and end up smoothing them out a little bit more than I wanted them to, but I add the texture back in later. But now I'm making some little cones to make his little toes, and I don't add the back toes because then otherwise his legs would be up and I didn't want to do that. So he just has 3 little toes right now. And I also give him thicker pads on his feet because I was noticing that the wire was poking through a little bit. So now he has thick feet too. And this was where I stared at him for too long and decided he needed a bigger throat, you know? Because why not? And crows, they caw, and it's like a deep caw, you know? It's like caw. Except not like that at all. I then take his head off and begin to blend his throat with the ball stylus. And off screen, I ended up smoothing out some other parts as well that needed some touch-ups, and this is what he looks like. So now I can pop him into the oven and he's baked, yay! So now I can start painting him. And I start with orange and start to paint the pumpkin part, and this is just the first layer, so I'm not too worried about getting all the nooks and crannies, just trying to cover the best that I can with the first layer. And when I paint the pumpkin part up top of his head, for the meat part of it, I end up going in with an orange and white combo. And once that's all done, I move on to painting his tail black. But I don't just stop there, I obviously continue using the black on his head and on his wings and even on his little leggies and feet. And there are some spots that I missed with some white showing through, but it's okay, it's just the first layer, you know? I then move on to painting the little stem, and I paint it an umber brown because umber brown is fun. And this is what he looks like, all nice and close. As you can see, there's still white popping through from some nooks and crannies, so I go in with the second layer of all the paint. And so now that everything's all nice and filled in, I can start to do the blending, which is my favorite part. And the first stop on my journey is to blend his beak, so I go in with a gray color before then going in with some more black and just blending that all out so the beak becomes more prominent and doesn't get lost within all the shadows. And I also take that same gray and dust it up top of his legs so there's some more contrast. Next, I take a white and orange blend and put that in the middle of each of the sections of the pumpkin, and that includes the top of his head as well. And I don't just stop there with the white and orange, I also do the top of the pumpkin rim too, because I just thought the different hues of orange and black right next to each other really make each individual color pop. After that, I add in some highlights onto the eyes, and I made sure that the black was all dried before adding on the highlights. I've learned my lesson after the last 2 weeks of messing up. And speaking of messing up, I blended umber brown and orange together to get this color I am putting in between the pumpkin ridges, and I ended up putting it in all of the ridges before then deciding I really hated it. So I added in some red into the mix, and it really begun to pop. So I go over all of the ridges all over again, and also the bottom of the pumpkin to give it a shadowed look. And once I get done all of that, I move on to getting some more gray paint and putting putting that onto the feathers and blending that all out in the middle to give it more of a contrast so it's not so boring to look at. And I continue this method on his wings as well, and then I also put some on the back of his neck and underneath both of his eyes. Next, I continue with some touch-ups on his beak and his legs just to make them more highlighted. And that's pretty much the craft. I would like to say thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And now it's time for the glamour shots.